Before giving the digital floor to my colleague Anders, I would like to say a few words about the Norwegian and the European context for developing such a program. So Anders, if you are so kind to show the first slide. Thank you very much. As you probably know, Norway, as well as the other Nordic countries, does not have a long tradition in talent development. But one of the milestones, I could say, was in 2016 when the government named a group of experts to write a report on who the students with higher potential are and what are their needs. So this report can be accessed on the net. It's called More to Gain, Better Learning for Students with Learning Potential. And it is the first time that these students are recognized at the educational policy level, and their needs and the need to create different opportunities for their potential to develop. And almost in the same time, it was released a white paper called Quality Culture in Higher Education. And in this white paper, the government actually provides more tools and guidelines required to raise the quality in higher education. And actually, they mentioned honor programs. It's one of the interventions that they mentioned. And the white paper, Education for Adjustment, it's hard to translate it even in English, but it's like education adjusted to the challenges of today. Also points to the 20th century skills and the need for innovation and entrepreneurship and more student-active teaching and learning forms. And of course, this white papers are influenced by the policies at the European Union level. So if you can switch to the next slide, please, Anders. Yes. So there is a demand from the European level that the higher institutions should address, like, for example, high digital competencies, critical solving and problem-solving skills. And these are increasingly important these days, not to mention that Norway signed the European Green Deal and committed to contribute to its implementation. So it's a kind of a pressure, but also an invitation to invest even more in the education of the new generation. And who else is more fit actually than the honor students to tackle the new challenges and to come with innovative solutions. So I will not keep you longer. I will give the floor to Anders because the essence is in the program. Thank you so much. Please, Anders.
Thanks, Ella. So with that was also the backdrop for us when we started to think about how to design another honors program in the Norwegian context. And actually, we had been thinking of this almost for 15 years prior to the one, this white paper from the national government that Ella mentioned, which sort of opened the door, at least politically, to start to talk about talent programs or honors programs and sort of gain some acceptance to this type of notion. But we actually took a slightly different path in the sense that when we started the process at the University of Oslo, the first things that we tried to establish was to establish a set of foundational principles essentially for the program. So we ended up having a consensus around these foundational principles, and I'll sort of tell you a bit about these principles, which probably are not that surprising to you, but also how the program is built to support those various principles. So the two sort of general principles are related around interdisciplinarity and excellence. And then there are these three principles that you often meet. Marka Wolfensbergen also mentioned them in her books, but they come from self-determination theory, essentially around autonomy, competence, and relatedness. But if I sort of start with the top, the interdisciplinarity, this was essentially a consensus agreement at the university. We had a long discussion. Should we go primarily, for instance, for students who want to progress faster? want to have a rapid progression through an ordinary bachelor program or an ordinary master program, or do we want to go to this towards the students who want to broaden their horizon, so that we want to develop something that has this broadening perspective of interdisciplinarity, or to some degree even transdisciplinarity in this particular program. And we ended up with a consensus that we wanted to attract students that were not only interested in mathematics or physics or philosophy, but they were interested and of course deeply interested in these subjects, but they also had a view of, well, they wanted to engage more broadly than just within their discipline. And when we announced our program, or when we announced the program, and also when we advertised our program, we state this quite explicitly, that this is for students who want to have sort of a broader perspective. And how is this built into the program? Well, I'll come more back to that, but the idea is that we choose a common theme. So it's not really a challenge as such, it's more like a theme that we address from different perspectives. And then we develop courses that also develop interdisciplinary skills. And in particular also for the students to get a different view of their own sets of skills that comes from within their own discipline. But it's, at least now we're quite happy that we chose this foundational principle, because at least in the Norwegian context, it makes it easier to argue for our program than if you had just chosen excellence as the foundation or foundational principle. But of course, we also want to recruit highly motivated students, and we want to challenge them. And I think also when we argue now around the program, we try to ensure that if we want to challenge students more than other students, so if you want to select some students, challenge them more, they also need more support. Because part of the underlying discussion in Norway is around, is it fair to support some students more than other students when they are following similar type of programs? But I found that, and I think this is a rather fair argument also, that if you demand more of some students, well, they also need to have more support. So how do we support them? Well, we support them in various ways. We support them in developing their own autonomy. And to some degree, this program has been an answer to what happened in Norway around 2003, where we went from rather open, almost liberal arts type programs, not completely, but at least with more degree of freedom in choosing and selecting the contents of your bachelor programs, to have more structured bachelor programs. So there was a national reform in 2003, where we also ensure that our programs were in line with the Bologna process, essentially, and the Bologna programs in Europe. We went to the 3+2 structure for a master. So we're somehow returning to the more free structure without these very programmed study programs. So we open for students to be able to design their own study programs to some degree, but to do that in a responsible way, they need to do it in discussion with an expert, with a mentor that follows them and is able to help them develop their own career and make the type of choices when they compose their study programs. And of course, I mean, we want to challenge the students additionally. So the students, they typically follow an ordinary study program together with other students. But in addition to that, they have extra courses. So we encourage them to have more than ordinary progression. But they need to have extra courses in this interdisciplinary fields. These are specially designed interdisciplinary courses that all the students need to take. But approximately 50% of the students in practice now follow more than ordinary progression in addition to just following these honors courses. And the idea also that when we demand more of them, we also need to provide them with more supervision in form of these mentors, and also some other types of supervision and support that I'll come back to. And in addition, we also want to ensure that students feel that they are part of a cohort, that they feel that they are part of, or they meet students that have similar type of aspirations as themselves. And we also support building up this learning environment around this cohort with dedicated workshops. They have their own facilities and they have their own mentors. And I'll talk a bit more about how we try to support that relatedness and this learning environment, because it's so essential to have this safe learning environment if you want to succeed with interdisciplinarity, or even more if you want to succeed with transdisciplinarity, I think. Okay, so how is this actually then how do all of these principles materialize into the study program design? So this is a rather densely packed slide now, but it reflects a bachelor program, 3-year bachelor program. The first year is on the bottom here. The second year is in the middle, and the top year is on top. And I also sort of describe that indeed they follow essentially an ordinary bachelor program. So this is what provides all the students with the disciplinary depth. But in addition, they have this interdisciplinary range, where they have an additional set of specially designed courses that's currently only for the honor students. And we've just selected a few directions that are sort of the pilot directions for the honor programs in natural sciences, that are physics and mathematics. We have chosen those 2 programs because they have very similar program structure. In the humanities, it's a bit broader. It's linguistics, philosophy, and musicology. And in the social sciences, which is starting now this fall, we haven't yet recruited our first students there. It's a bachelor in psychology, social anthropology, sociology, sociology, and political science. So that's sort of the core. This is what they spend most of the time on, the ordinary bachelor programs. But in addition to that, they have 1 extra course each semester. The first year, that's sort of organized around the theme. So we choose one particular theme. The annual theme we have chosen for the first 3 to 5 years is around artificial intelligence. And we chose this because this was a good meeting place for the natural sciences and the humanities initially. So both linguists, philosophy, and mathematics and physics are sort of interested in artificial intelligence and machine learning. It's changing all of these fields. So there are sort of things happening within the disciplines, but it's also a good meeting place for these disciplines. So the first year we are focusing on that theme. I'll come back to how we're doing that, but we have 1 course where they get an introduction to that theme together. The second year we focus more on methods. So then we try to build up essentially a background in the disciplinary methods and practices. We also have a particular focus on computing and data science. So we want to teach all of them and bring all of them up to sort of good level in what I consider an important transferable skill, which is being able to think using a computer, what we call computational literacy. And the final year, the third year, we put it all together in 1 large project, essentially, where they first learn something about how to work in groups, and then they actually perform a project which is in a research group or in industry or in an NGO or government. Okay, let's dive a bit further in. So how this program is now organized across the whole university. So there are 3 different colleges, what we call faculties in Norwegian colleges involved. It's the College of Mathematics and Natural Sciences, it's the College of the Humanities, and the College of the Social Sciences. And interestingly enough, we all have very different teaching practices and philosophies. So just being able to collaborate across these different colleges is a challenge by itself. We have different means of measuring how we teach, for instance, different models of compensations per student. So there's a lot of practical challenges. But essentially what we've done is that we've organized it so that the different colleges have responsibility for different type of courses. So I mentioned this first course, the first semester, the interdisciplinary theme. That's now basically the sciences that are responsible for this. The second year, we have divided it a bit further. We have 1 course on computational thinking, which is essentially natural sciences trying to teach some core competences, programming in particular, to the humanities and also to the social scientists. This is actually an interesting, so we developed this over the years, over 2 years now, and we piloted it with the honors program, and then it's now actually being implemented into a full-scale course for all humanities students starting this fall. And in addition to that, we have another course on interdisciplinary methods, which is more to introduce the science students to the various types of methods that are used in the humanities and also in the social sciences. Interestingly enough, the students are, so some of the humanities students were interested in taking this interdisciplinary methods course. They are allowed to do that. However, we did not allow any of the science students to follow the course in computational thinking because they have integrated this already in their course, the ordinary study program. And this would probably make the teaching situation a bit more challenging. And then the last year we have this course, where we first focus on groups and group processes. And then the second semester there, the last semester, it's we are doing or performing one interdisciplinary project work. So this actually fits quite nice with the social sciences, because in particular in psychology, they have a lot of experience with teaching courses related to, let's say, group processes and interdisciplinary, how to work in an interdisciplinary group, and also how to use that situation to learn about yourself and how you function in a group and how we can take various roles in these group processes. So this, yeah, I'm quite excited about how that will develop. So let's look at this first year. So this is how they start with one interdisciplinary theme. And the idea then is the learning outcome is essentially that we want them to see how various disciplinary researchers approach the same theme. But we want them to go in depth. So it shouldn't be sort of just superficial. They should actually go in depth and try to talk about their real research problems. And then the idea is that when the students see these various types of research problems, and then so both the questions and the answers, or the questions and the approach that they choose to address those questions, and sort of the results. The results are actually not that interesting. I think the two first are the most important, the questions and the approaches. They see this presented by researchers that work in their field, and then try to interact with those researchers in a meaningful way. That's the idea. And the challenge, I must say, has been to be able to come rapidly to depth, to be able to actually tell these researchers that you should dare to actually talk about something that might be a bit too difficult for the students, so that they need to prepare properly. But in addition to that, so we have this every second week, and then the week between, they prepare essentially. Either they prepare or they sum up what happened the last week. So they prepare in the sense that they try to read up on what the coming researcher that's presenting, giving his type of TED talk. Then they try to read up on that researcher to understand it in advance, essentially, and to prepare questions, and also to ensure that they have confidence in their questions. Because this is, if you want this to succeed, I mean, basically we are taking in now the best high school students in Norway. We're placing them in the same class, but they have different backgrounds, and then we try to get them to interact outside their field of their zone of comfort, at least. I mean, it's you want a student who sort of is an expert in mathematics to ask a philosopher question. And of course, then if you ask that question, it can be a really stupid one. In principle, I mean, I've often been in that situation myself. I work across the boundary between physics and biology. When I ask a question, it could be a really deep question, or it can be something that's in the first course they take in biology. And I never really know what sort of where my question will land, and to have the confidence to be able to ask those questions when you are young and you're trying to establish your identity. This is actually quite difficult. So it really needs it's solid support in the form of a learning environment and trust in that in your fellow students, essentially. So that's why we spend a lot of time on this preparation, and also on what I would call like it's like a debriefing afterwards, where we discuss what happened in the what did you get out of the discussion, and what did you get out of the discussion, and then you see that different students with different backgrounds get different things out of the same discussion also. So then the whole idea is to gain these different perspectives. In addition to that, and also when we organize those discussions, they are rather structured. So we try to structure them well, that they give a 45-minute presentation, then they have like a 15 minutes to wait a bit, and then we structure this discussion quite, for instance, I do quite direct management of who's speaking when, so I try to ensure that the students are not contributing much, that we also lift them up, that there are questions both from the humanities and the sciences and the social sciences, that there are questions from both genders, for instance, and we also have small tricks that we have included, like never also telling all the presenters to always take the first question from a female, a woman. So we instruct them specifically to do this, and this has actually been quite important for the dynamics in class. So we try to really ensure that they have time to get to know each other. So and then the idea of this is essentially to build also a meta perspective on their own skills. So the idea is that as a mathematician, for instance, you get a new perspective on what are the transferable skills that you learn as part of learning mathematics, the way you think, essentially. You get a new perspective of how you learn to think by interacting with other students. And I got a question now about, which was a good question. We teach them to work in groups in the third year, but they started to work in groups already in the first year, and that's true. And we could have done that in a different way, but I think it's what we do primarily in the third year is to provide them with a theoretical foundation on how to work in groups also. But maybe this actually might be useful to bring in the first year. I could comment on shortly. We have a startup seminar for all the students, which we typically do within the first 2 to 3 weeks. And the focus there is really on starting to establish this type of social learning environment. And we also have some focus on how do you act in a group and how can you use the next 3 years when you're a student to observe and try to make sense out of how group processes work. So we get them to start to observe and reflect, and then they get sort of a framework to put it into a bit later in their education. And these discussions currently are closed, so they're only available for the honor students. And we had a long discussion about this, whether we wanted to have them closed or not. There are good arguments for opening them up, because that might mean that we could include more students in these type of discussions. We decided to close them because we focused on having this learning environment where it's okay to ask the questions. So we are just worried that if you open it up and there are many unknown students in the class, it would be more challenging for students to step outside their comfort zone, essentially. So we have thought about it, but this was sort of the decision we made. And I just listed up on the right here some examples of the types of talks that we had the first year. These are essentially from top researchers in their fields. Like Arnoldo Forgesi is the one who's running the COVID models in Norway. He's basically responsible for the prediction of every day or every week of how COVID is developing in Norway. And he's also one of the leading statistical researchers in Norway. So we bring them into class and then they tell about what they're doing and how artificial intelligence is sort of affecting or are part of their way of thinking. So how do we work to support this interdisciplinarity? And like I was already mentioned, we work a lot on establishing the learning environment. We have this intro week. So this is the first week before they start with their studies, where they also meet, all the students meet. Typically we try to get them to say something about what are their expectations. And they all do this in groups, and then we try to group that together so that they can see that many of them have similar expectations. We also try to sort of set up a set of common values. So what I typically done there is that we have established those values and then we put them up on a board. So they are essentially in their classroom the whole year. You can see what type of values they agreed on. And they're typically generosity or being open and being supportive and this type of very sort of sound values for building a good learning environment. I see that discussion by giving them sort of ideas in the direction I would like them to think. So it's not, it seems like an open process, but it's not a completely open process. Then we also have this two-year startup seminar where we focus on building the learning environment, but also reflecting on yourself. And then, as I mentioned, we script the discussion. And in particular, we also have common facilities, so they sit together. And I also spend quite a lot of time there with the students, and typically also done very simple things like just ordering pizza after all the discussions. And then we encourage the speaker in this first year course to sit there afterwards and discuss with the students. And I sit there, and sometimes I also invite other people in just to interact with the students so that they feel that they get this contact with some grown-ups that they often really are thirsting. So that's one part. We also work on developing this type of transferable skills. One of them, as I mentioned, is that I consider quite important is what I tend to think of as computational literacy. but it's essentially being able to think and use the computer to help your thinking process, both when it comes to processing data, but also when it comes to formulating your ideas. We work on group processes, like I mentioned initially and throughout, and we also work on various types of writing and presentation. The first year they do these reflection notes where they write a reflection note on the talk, and then they get feedback on those reflection notes. And we have different types of activities where they had like board discussions or panel discussions, and then they have other types of sort of group activities that are designed to help them build this working environment. And we also have sort of typically project-driven courses later that are sort of designed for this type of interdisciplinary interdependence, in the sense that we design the projects so that they require input from both science students, humanities students, and social science students. I'll come back to that because it doesn't really work. Well, not all aspects of that work as we would like to have. So some of the students have input on that, but the idea is at least that we want them to interact on the projects. We also work on co-creation of learning material, in the sense that I hired one summer, I hired 14 of the students to essentially make small short courses to introduce the next cohort of students to some of the main themes. So some of the humanities students made a rapid introduction to ethics, and some of the science students made a rapid introduction to some aspects of programming and implementing AI models. I think that sort of overall that worked reasonably well. On reflection, there are sort of two aspects of that. One is that I think that the students involved in that, in teaching, they learn a lot. But the students that sort of were on the receiving end were expressed sort of a disappointment, in the sense that they wanted to meet sort of researchers and not only their fellow students. And this is sort of a challenge, and we need to figure out how to do that in a good way forward. I think it's useful for the students to contribute in this way. In addition to that, we also have what I call course transformation teams, and these are typically older students that are used to develop the learning material. So for instance, when we develop learning material in the programming course for the humanities, or this data-driven course, there we use typically third, fourth, or fifth year students in small groups. So they are typically groups of both science students and humanities students, for instance, constructing all the examples in this course in programming for the humanities. We have a lot of experience with this type of course transformation processes. And then, of course, also the mentor program is important in this. They get mentors. They get at least 3 discussions with their mentors per semester. This is sort of the minimum we set up. We also set up training programs for the mentors. So they're all trained, in the sense that we bring in psychology experts from the university who are experienced in having these type of discussions with students, who essentially teach. And we have some small practice sessions also on how to initiate the discussion, how to ensure that you have sort of have a good discussion with the students. We also had focus now the last year on how to have this type of mentoring discussions over Zoom, for instance, so that you still can build sort of a comfortable zone where it's possible to share and think out aloud. Okay, so let's just share some experiences and some of the impact. So I've sort of divided this into some of the experiences that teachers typically report and some of the experiences that students report. Let me start by one overarching experience from designing the whole program, and that was when we just had been able to design the program. We built this whole program essentially in 1 year. And I remember coming out of the final meeting when we sort of had built the program, and one of the philosophy professors is sort of just impulsively said out that this was so maybe the most fun process he'd ever experienced at the university, because it was so fast. We were able to actually get change in 1 year. And I think this is something that might be important to think about when you're doing this type of change, that if it takes too long, it's easy to lose the momentum and the inspiration you get from working together and actually seeing it being realized. And actually quite a lot of the participating faculty have been quite energized by this whole process, that we were actually able to do it in very, very short time. Another challenge is that there are different teaching cultures in the humanities, the sciences, and probably also in the social sciences. And it's difficult just to consolidate them, to figure out good ways. You have to start to do it, essentially, just to have discussions and to start to see where those differences are and how you can work around them or how we can use them to your advantage. I think for the students, it's good actually to see different type of teaching styles and teaching approaches so that they get a broader experience and background from themselves. We also seen that this has nucleated new collaborations. So there are actually several new large-scale research collaborations that's essentially come from some of these talks that were given as part of the honors program, because sometimes you have talks, sometimes you have panel discussions, and sometimes you then meet other researchers that you haven't met before, and you start to interact. And this was also part of what we wanted to do. We wanted to have like a nucleus for interdisciplinary activity on campus that maybe also could spread in other directions. And sometimes it's easier to start to collaborate on education than to start to collaborate on research. So, it's also worked as a pilot program in some sense. We use it to pilot new changes. One thing is, of course, to start to work on this almost transdisciplinary type of working, that we choose at least a common theme and maybe then eventually also some more challenge-based type approaches. Currently, we have only had one theme, so the only theme we have done currently is artificial intelligence. And the reason for that is that I want to ensure that we first get the whole program running, that we have run through 3 years of the program before we start to make changes to the type of themes that we will choose. But we have thought about all the themes that are related to sustainability, for instance, but it needs to be, we also need to take into account what students are entering the program. So as social sciences students are entering, it opens up the program to more type of challenges that can be handled by the student group. Particularly case I already mentioned, this programming course for the humanities was essentially piloted with this group of honor students, and they are it's very easy to interact with them. They are reflective. They are able to provide useful constructive feedback on teaching and the contents of the courses. So it's a very powerful group to develop this type of, to pilot new learning approaches or new type of curriculums, essentially. If you look at what the students say, I mean, we do see that, and I think what we wanted to achieve was to see that peer learning is actually efficient, and that you learn by discussing with your peers. We know this is the core of student active, what we call student active learning activities in large classroom settings. But it's also something that we see that the students reflect on. Here in a slightly different perspective, one student said that the best thing about the seminars, these are these TED Talks and the seminars after them in the first year. So the best thing about the seminars, in my view, is to learn what the other students learn from the previous seminar. So they not only is having this reflection round where the students reflect, write the reflection notes, and then seeing their different reflection notes actually provides useful insights, which is this type of meta learning we're looking for. But you also see that these diverse backgrounds sometimes pose challenges. This is from the second year program where they worked on these data-driven projects, where one of the students says that since we science students had to do all the code in the programming, it was too difficult for the humanities students. There was not so much time for us to discuss ethics, which I really wish we could do more. So we are also doing this iteratively, so we are gradually changing these courses, and so this is sort of a typical feedback that we would expect to get, that we need to adjust the courses. But it's interesting to see that the students really want to have this type of interaction. They don't want to take a problem and sort of divide it and say, you do the programming because you are the data analysis because you're from the mathematics, and you do the ethics discussion. They really want to be involved across those type of typically disciplinary boundaries. And of course, this feeling of relatedness is indeed important. I mean, the students say things like, I finally met students similar to me, were engaged and active, social and AI, and the discussions went hand in hand. And considered it a success when the first year we had 20 students. It was a small cohort. We're now scaling up to 60 students. But the first year we had 20 students, and of those 20 students, we had 10 of them essentially were living together in 3 large, they were essentially renting apartments together. So it means that they actually formed this type of bonds that we would like to develop. Good. I think that was sort of summing up some of the aspects of sort of the program construction, and then I think I'll give the word back to Ella.
Thank you very much, Anders. I will try to be very short because we need some time for questions. So the road ahead, I would say the roads ahead. There is a possibility to adjust the approach, the honors program's approach that we experienced, and to implement it at different levels in the educational system or to the regular student population. We are so lucky to be partners in the STEAM Plus Erasmus Plus project, and the main actually objective of this project is to innovate higher education for handling the complex challenges using the knowledge and the innovative pedagogies that are developed through the honor programs. This allows us to, we have 18 partners, and it allows us to network with different higher education institutions that have more experience than us and exchange the experiences from this from the honor programs. So, but if you want more, there is a session on Friday at 10 o'clock on the STEAM Plus project, so please attend that if you are interested. And there are also lots of, we could have a master, European master with honor programs. There are the possibilities for to apply for European universities. The EU Commission aims actually to gather a new generation of creative Europeans that are able to cooperate across borders and cross-disciplinary and so on. But I think I would like to give a chance to the participants to ask questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, both of you. I think, there are 3 questions in the chat that you didn't answer. Perhaps we can start with those questions. 2 questions from Anna and 1 from Martina. Could one of you answer the questions?
Let's see which ones I didn't catch. I'd be happy to share the slides. Let's say, so we have, so Anna, I think you had one question, which I think I almost answered, but I can just reiterate that, whether all students are able to participate in this type of interdisciplinary discussions. And I would say,
sorry. I'm sorry, it's about training in systems thinking.
Oh yeah, okay, I'll be happy to answer that. Currently, they have we don't really teach them this type of things outside the, so the focus has primarily been on teaching them sort of very specific skills in the form of, let's say, data science, computing, writing skills, this type of things. The physics students, of course, they will have a strong background in thermodynamics, which allows them to address those type of topics. I'm a physicist myself, so I typically find entropy a rather difficult topic to discuss or to teach without a sort of an in-depth understanding of physics and entropy outside of physics. I have no meaning or intuition about that. But this might change if we move to a different type of theme where this would be a more natural part of the first year. So for AI, this is not sort of that essential. So there we focused on what I would call essential skills. What the students often refer to is that they need to have, let's say, a background in ethics just to be able to follow the discussions in ethics, so that we can skip sort of the basic levels and you're able to understand the terminology. The same when it comes to the mathematical parts, where it's actually a bit more difficult because it's mathematics and is more of an sequential subject where it's sometimes difficult to skip portions. But I think we have had some success, at least in training them and getting them to understand some of the basic concepts. Still, what students typically complain about actually is that they don't find the TED Talks difficult enough. So I think we're still erring on the part that they are so too superficial. We want them to be even more in depth. And I think that's my personal feeling also, that it's okay not to be able to understand everything. As still you're sort of able to because you can sometimes get the gist, or maybe you understand something about again, not the details, but you get an understanding about what are the questions asked and what are the approaches used to address those questions. That might be more important than the details of the arguments, essentially. Yes, so there was a comment on AI, whether it has a physical dimension. Yes, so but it's mostly discussed. So we do what we do is that through when we address it in the first year, we take in various perspectives, which are typically perspectives of researchers. So we did have the first year, we had a very interesting perspective from a research philosopher who had just written a book on the philosophy of AI, essentially, which is sort of now an emerging field, which is quite interesting. We also had had somebody who tried to sort of put it more in the perspective of basic philosophy, like logic, essentially. And we also had people coming from the neurosciences to sort of provide backgrounds on how do you understand not artificial but biological intelligence, and how can that understanding of biological intelligence help us understand artificial intelligence, and the opposite way, how can our understanding of artificial intelligence help us understand biological intelligence. I think Martina also had a question about examples of annual themes, and again, we haven't sort of really made those specific yet. We just had this very broad theme of artificial intelligence, and when it comes to other type of themes that are more related to sustainability, I'm still sort of trying to find themes that will appeal to the students, like students in mathematics and physics, philosophy, linguistics, and sort of to be able to appeal to all of these type of students, and we also need to have a sort of a type of consensus process to find those questions or challenges, essentially, that we want to address.
Okay, I cannot see any questions come up, but I have two questions which are relating to each other, because at the beginning you actually said that, I mean, excellence is one of the common ground for the honors program, and also you selected highly motivated students to challenge them further. So I just wanted to ask, what is the excellence for you? And then highly motivated, which means that you select them based on their motivational letter, or based on their grades, or based on both, or how is your selection criteria?
I can tell a bit about it. So in Norway, there is a central system for applying to higher education. So it means that if you want to apply for higher education, you have one, essentially you can just provide one prioritized list of the study programs that you want to go into, which means that, and you will actually be then evaluated in that order and in that sequence. So for instance, if you want to apply to medicine, which sort of typically is the most difficult programs to get into in Norway, you would put that on top. The tricky part then is that if you want to go outside, and that ranking is just based on the grades, and then there are some other complicated rules, but they are the same rules for all study programs in Norway. So we cannot really we are not allowed to make local rules. We could make a rule like to say, for instance, you need to have at least this grade in mathematics. But typically the grade you would then set would be unrealistically low, actually, because you'd want all the students have the maximum grade in mathematics that enter the mathematics program. But you would typically not say that, at least not in Norway. so we can only, if we follow that system, we can only use their grades. And this is a challenge for us if we want to place weight on additional aspects, because we cannot, for instance, so what would happen, for instance, if we said that, well, we are going to place weight on both grades and a motivational letter? Well, then the challenge is that you'd have to evaluate those motivation letters very rapidly, because students, they don't want to risk to say yes to a position, to maybe get a position at the honors program, because then they would have to say no to a position at the in medicine, for instance, in the medicine program. So so that's why it's very difficult to add additional criteria. So when I say motivation, I can't really measure motivation when we recruit students in this way. So we could have recruited students in a different way. We could, for instance, have recruited them not directly from high school, but instead maybe after a year at university. So this is a possibility. But it was also strategically important for us to have programs that were very competitive in these areas, so that you would recruit students that are that score well on school grades at least. Then, of course, there is a long discussion about whether that is, like what Ella is an expert on, whether those are really the students with the highest potential. But it's difficult for us when we're sort of inside the system to be able to rank them on different type of criteria. So it's a pragmatic way to address it. And when so how do we know that we get students that are motivated, for instance? We can't really know it, except that we can say when we announce the system that this is for highly motivated students, and hope that there is some type of self-selection. So the highly motivated students who do have the grades to enter this program are able to enter it. But it's a challenge. This type of recruiting is really a bit of a challenge, because it's important also to be able to recruit good students, and good students, they, at least in Norway, since this is their grades are their one currency, there is no other way to skip these lines than to get better grades. So this is sort of the currency they have, and they want to exchange this currency, their good grades, into something that they find valuable when they enter the university. And that makes some programs that are perceived as being very competitive. It's like in physics, we tend to think of this as instabilities. As soon as you sort of have a program that's very competitive, all the students will perceive them as being competitive and interesting, and they will continue to be competitive and interesting. Because if you're a 19-year-old and you apply for a high school in Norway, then you actually say something, I want to study this one, and then you get out a list that says this is the most difficult program to get into. You need to have this type of grades to enter here. And then you can immediately see essentially where on the list, where can I get the maximum out of my grades within the area that I'm interested in. But maybe you have more on thoughts on this, Ella. This is your field of expertise in some sense.
Well, what can I say? In the literature, there is no universal standard way of identifying and recruiting the students. So like you said, you had to adjust to the Norwegian system, the recruiting, but it's clear that at this age, the students, they know their strong points, and they know that they are able to and capable of handling such a program and working in interdisciplinary, and have the patience and tålmodighet, what's that? Yeah, the patience, and they get into the. So this is what I say, that there are different ways of recruiting them. But I don't think from the generation you recruited others that any of them went sideways, or nobody gave up. None of the ones that started gave up, or.
That's actually true. We had in practice, we have had 0 dropouts. It's not really true, but it's because in the second cohort, there was one person who didn't finish, but he actually never started. He had already finished a 5-year degree and he had started in a job and he wanted to do this on the side. That was basically not realistic. The first year we had one student who was uncertain whether he wanted to continue on his medical studies or whether he wanted to continue on this program. So this is the challenge we have in Norway then. Then they can apply to more than one program. They can use their grades more than once. So they can occupy more than one spot, basically. So and we actually have quite interesting discussions now in ethics about the students or about the ethics of this with the students. Is it sort of ethical actually to reserve a spot just because you have good grades? Because you can use them every year. So every year you can apply to a new program and you can reserve a spot there basically. And it means that somebody else, because you can only follow one of these programs at a time, so you can apply to both the medical program and to the honors program. You can do the medical program the first year, the honors program the second year, and then nanotechnology the third year. And basically you'd be occupying 3 spots. And we can't stop this. So we have no way of stopping this except to actually speak to the students and get them to understand that we consider this behavior unethical, basically. Or get them to understand it themselves by discussion.
Thank you so much. Actually, I wanted to ask, but you already answered that whether anyone ever gave up the program or not, because I was also very curious to know that, I mean, whether they gave up, but you already answered. So, any other question from participants? No. Then I have another question. Actually, I was very curious because you said a lot about the interdisciplinary in your program. Do you see that in future, for example, you will shift to the transdisciplinary approach, or you think that is too much, or is it feasible, or is not?
I think I'm not really certain yet, because it's sort of, I think it's a good way to think, and then it sort of comes to what degree do you want this to go through the whole program in some sense. Do you really want to take this all the way so that the students, and it becomes almost more like problem-based learning in some sense. You choose this challenge and then you sort of you figure out various ways to do it. So it's a bit tricky developing these type of transdisciplinary programs, because you're also a developing person while you're doing it. So you need to make some selections when it comes to courses and sort of some, and I'm not sure that we would be able currently, at least, to bridge all of these programs in a truly transdisciplinary way. But we could probably have like a transdisciplinary build, sort of overarching building in some sense. We could say that you follow your basic programs where you learn sort of your basic skills, but then the honors program is a sort of as a transdisciplinary approach, so that all the courses in the honors program are essentially focused on one challenge and then working towards resolving or addressing that challenge. So I think that's possible, but I find it really difficult to make that to make a program that's completely transdisciplinary, because let's say in physics, for instance, you cannot, if you want to be able to develop new battery technologies, you need to understand quantum mechanics, and in order to and then there is a long list of things that you need to understand. So you need to make that decision quite early on in order to make that impact later, and you cannot sort of just jump around. So there needs to be some type of structure that provides you with some of the skills that you need. But in addition, you would like to have that transdisciplinary overbuilding. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Maybe our STEAM Plus project can help on this as well. So look at the time. I think, although I mean we really enjoyed your presentation and the discussion, but we have to close the session now. I would like to thank you, both of you, again for your really interesting and excellent presentation. And I wish all of you and all the participants to enjoy the rest of the day.